December 1943, Ortona, Italy. This ancient seaport sits on steep cliffs overlooking the gray waters of the Adriatic Sea. For 3,000 years, people have lived in this jumble of stone buildings crowded together on the rocky promontory. Now the town has become a graveyard. German paratroopers from Hitler's elite 1st Parachute Division have transformed every building into a fortress and every street into a killing zone. The narrow roads are choked with rubble. Whole buildings have been blown apart, their massive stones tumbling down to create barriers 10 to 15 feet high. Behind these walls of broken rock, German soldiers wait with machine guns. Above them, snipers peer from shattered windows. Tripwires crisscross doorways, connected to explosives that can tear a man apart. The smell of cordite and death hangs in the cold December air. This is where the Canadians are heading, and the Germans know exactly who is coming for them. A warning order has been passed down through the German ranks. The words are simple and terrifying. You are fighting an elite Canadian-American force. They are treacherous, unmerciful, and clever. You cannot afford to relax. One German officer will be so concerned about facing these soldiers that he promises a 10-day vacation to the first man who captures one alive. The Germans need to know what they are up against. They need to understand their enemy, because the stories they have heard from the Great War still echo in their minds. Back in 1918, German commander Erich Ludendorff sat in his headquarters when the reports came flooding in. Canadian forces had smashed through his defenses at Amiens. They advanced 13 kilometers in a single day. His soldiers were surrendering in massive numbers. Others were fleeing in panic. Ludendorff called it Black Day of the German Army. Now, 25 years later, a new generation of German soldiers faces the descendants of those same shock troops. The stakes in Ortona are enormous. By December 1943, Nazi Germany controls most of Europe. Millions suffer under occupation. The Allies need to break through the winter line that runs across Italy. They need to push north toward Rome. They need to drain German resources away from other battlefronts. But the Germans have prepared for this moment. They have turned the Italian mountains and rivers into a defender's paradise. In just 1 month of fighting in Italy, Canadian casualties will reach 2,265 men. 484 of them will die. Nearly 1/4 of all Canadian losses in the entire Italian campaign will happen in the single month that soldiers will call Bloody December. The cost is almost too terrible to imagine. The old way of fighting is not working. When Allied infantry cross open streets, German machine guns cut them down. When Sherman tanks roll down the main highway through Ortona, hidden anti-tank guns destroy them one by one. The Germans know every angle. They know every firing position. They have spent weeks preparing their defenses. They expect the Allies to attack the way textbooks say armies should attack, street by street, building by building, slowly and predictably. The British have tried it their way. They attack with overwhelming force. They move carefully and professionally, but carefully means slowly, and slowly means more men die. The Americans fight with tremendous courage and enthusiasm. They charge forward with aggressive spirit, but they are still learning the brutal lessons of combat. They make mistakes that cost lives. The Canadians are different. They have always been different. These are not professional soldiers from military academies. These are volunteers from the far edges of the British Empire, lumberjacks who spent years felling giant trees in British Columbia forests, trappers who tracked animals through the frozen wilderness, fishermen who worked the brutal waters off Newfoundland, miners who dug into mountains for gold and coal, farmers who wrestled crops from the hard prairie soil. These men know cold. They know hardship. They know how to survive when survival seems impossible. Captain Bill Longhurst of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment is one of these men. He joined up when Canada called for volunteers. He trained in England with thousands of others. He landed in Sicily and fought his way up the Italian boot. Now he crouches in a stone building in Ortona while bullets chip away at the walls around him. His men are trapped. The building they occupy is secure for now, but they need to advance. The objective is 2 buildings away. Between here and there lies 30 feet of open street. Longhurst has already watched good men try to cross that killing ground. The German machine gun crews know their business. The bodies in the street prove it. The standard military doctrine is clear. You suppress the enemy position with artillery and machine gun fire. Then infantry rushes across the open ground. Then you clear the next building. Then you repeat the process. This is how armies have fought since the beginning of warfare. This is what they teach at staff colleges. But Longhurst is not thinking about what they teach at staff colleges. He is thinking about how to keep his men alive. He is thinking about the mission. He is thinking about the stone walls around him. Something occurs to him, something obvious that no one else has noticed. The ancient buildings of Ortona were built close together, very close. Their walls touch. The stones that separate one building from the next building are thick, but they are just stones, and stones can be broken. Longhurst looks at the interior wall. He looks at his engineers. He looks at the Teller anti-tank mines they carry. Those mines are designed to destroy 30-ton tanks. What would they do to a stone wall? An idea forms in his mind, an idea that will change urban warfare forever, an idea that will save countless lives and help win the battle for Ortona. Why go through the street when you can go through the wall? Captain Longhurst calls his engineers over. He points at the wall that separates his building from the next one. The engineers understand immediately. They have plastic explosive in their packs. They have the heavy Teller anti-tank mines that were meant for destroying German armor. These tools were designed for different purposes, but desperate times call for creative solutions. The engineers get to work. They mold the plastic explosive into a charge. The material is pliable, like thick clay. They press it against the interior wall on the top floor of the building. The charge needs to be big enough to blast through 3 feet of ancient stone, but not so big that it brings down the entire structure. This is delicate work. Too little explosive and you just crack the wall. Too much and you kill your own men when the ceiling collapses. The soldiers on the floor below wait. They huddle against the walls on the ground level, as far from the blast as possible. Their hands cover their ears. Some pray. Some check their weapons one more time. All of them know that in a few seconds everything will change. The explosion is tremendous. The building shakes. Dust and stone fragments fill the air. For a moment, no one can see anything. Then the dust begins to settle. On the top floor, where the charge was placed, there is now a ragged hole in the wall. It is just wide enough for one man to fit through at a time. A mouse hole. Longhurst gives the signal. His men rush up the stairs. The first soldier pulls the pin on a grenade and hurls it through the opening. The blast echoes in the confined space of the adjacent building. Before the smoke clears, Canadian infantry pour through the hole. Their Tommy guns bark in short, controlled bursts. They clear the top floor room by room. Then they work their way down to the ground level. The Germans in that building never expected an attack from above, from inside. They were watching the street. They were ready for soldiers to come through the door or the windows. They were not ready for enemies to suddenly appear from the floor above them, blasting through the ceiling and walls. Within 20 minutes, the building is secure, and now Longhurst's men can do it again. They move to the far wall of this new building and repeat the process. Mold the explosive. Set the charge. Take cover. Blast the wall. Throw grenades. Rush through. Clear the rooms. Building by building, block by block, never touching the deadly streets. When word of this tactic reaches the higher command, some officers are skeptical. This is not how the manual says to fight. The British military has volumes of doctrine on urban warfare. Those books describe proper procedures, artillery preparation, smoke screens, infantry advances under covering fire, room clearing techniques. There are rules, there are established methods. But those rules were written by men who were not dying in the streets of Ortona. Those methods were created by staff officers far from the fighting. Captain Longhurst and his men are learning what works by trial and error, by blood and death, and what works is going through walls instead of streets. Some officers worry that this mouse-holing technique is too dangerous. What if a charge is set wrong and kills Canadian soldiers? What if the buildings collapse? What if men get trapped in the rubble? These are valid concerns. War is full of risks. But Major General Christopher Vokes, commander of the 1st Canadian Division, sees something different. He sees innovation. He sees soldiers adapting to the battlefield. He sees a way to save lives and win the fight. Vokes gives his approval. Use whatever works, he tells his men. Take the town. On December 21st, 1943, the loyal Edmonton Regiment and the Seaforth Highlanders enter Ortona in force. They are supported by tanks from the Three Rivers Regiment. The Sherman tanks can provide fire support, but in the narrow streets they are vulnerable. German anti-tank weapons can destroy them easily. So the tanks hang back and the infantry push forward, using Longhurst's new technique. For 6 days and 6 nights, the battle rages. The Canadians blast their way through the old town building by building. They use Piat anti-tank weapons, originally designed to knock out German panzers, as wall-breaching tools. The Piat fires a small bomb that can punch through armor. It can also punch through stone walls. The weapon is awkward and heavy, but it works. When Piats are not enough, the engineers use larger charges. Sometimes they use the Teller mines themselves. These German mines were designed to destroy tanks, but they work just as well on walls. The irony is not lost on the Canadian soldiers. They are using captured enemy equipment to defeat the enemy. Inside each building, the fighting is brutal and close. Soldiers throw grenades around corners. They fire their weapons in hallways barely 6 feet wide. They fight hand-to-hand when ammunition runs low. The Tommy guns, with their high rate of fire and 45 caliber rounds, are perfect for this kind of combat. At ranges of 10 or 15 feet, they are devastating. The mouse-holing technique allows the Canadians to move through entire city blocks without exposing themselves to the German guns that cover the streets. The Germans fortified the ground-level entrances. They positioned machine guns to fire down the roads. They expected the Canadians to come from predictable directions. Instead, the Canadians come from every direction at once, from above, from below, through walls that should be solid. The psychological effect on the German defenders is enormous. They can hear the explosions as Canadian engineers blast through walls. They know the enemy is coming, but they do not know from where. The buildings they thought were secure suddenly become prisons. There is nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. The Canadians are everywhere. German paratroopers are some of the finest soldiers in the Wehrmacht. They are well trained and well equipped. They fight with courage and skill, but courage cannot stop plastic explosive from blowing a hole in your wall. Skill cannot help when grenades come tumbling through a fresh opening 3 floors up. These elite German troops find themselves outfought and outsmarted by Canadian farm boys and lumberjacks. The resources the Canadians use are simple: Piat anti-tank launchers, hand-molded plastic explosive, standard fragmentation grenades, Tommy guns and Lee-Enfield rifles, bayonets and entrenching tools. There are no wonder weapons, no secret technology, just ordinary infantry equipment used in extraordinary ways. By December 27th, after 8 days of the most savage urban combat the war has yet seen, the Germans withdraw from Ortona under cover of darkness. They leave behind a ruined town and the bodies of their dead. The Canadians have won. But the victory comes at a terrible price. Over 500 Canadian soldiers are dead or wounded. General Vaux will later say that everything before Ortona was a nursery tale. This is where boys became veterans. This is where a new way of fighting was born. And this is where the German fear of Canadian soldiers, first earned in the trenches of the Great War, was renewed and confirmed for a new generation. The reputation did not start at Ortona. It started decades earlier in the mud and blood of the First World War. To understand why Germans feared Canadians in 1943, you have to go back to 1915. April 22nd, 1915. The town of Ypres in Belgium. French colonial troops hold the line next to the Canadians. The afternoon is quiet except for the distant rumble of artillery. Then the wind shifts. From the German trenches, a yellow-green cloud rolls across no man's land. It hugs the ground like fog. But this is not fog. This is chlorine gas. The first poison gas attack in history. The French soldiers see the cloud coming. They do not know what it is. When the gas reaches their trenches, men start choking. Their lungs burn. They cannot breathe. Panic spreads. Thousands of French troops flee their positions, leaving a massive gap in the Allied line. The Canadians are next. The gas cloud reaches them. Men start coughing and gasping. Some collapse. Officers shout orders, but no one knows what to do. There are no gas masks. There is no training for this. In minutes, the entire Canadian line could break, and the Germans would pour through. But the Canadians do not run. Someone remembers that urine can neutralize chlorine. The word spreads. Soldiers pull out handkerchiefs. They urinate on the cloth. They press the wet fabric over their mouths and noses. It is disgusting. It barely works, but it is better than nothing. For hours, the Canadians hold their ground. They fire at German soldiers advancing behind the gas cloud. Their eyes stream with tears. Their throats are raw. Some men die choking in the trenches, but the line does not break. By the end of the battle, 5,000 Canadians are dead or wounded. But they saved the day. They plugged the gap the French left. They stopped a German breakthrough. The Germans take note. These colonial soldiers from across the ocean did not panic. They did not run. They adapted and held firm under conditions that broke veteran European troops. This is something to remember. 3 years later, August 8th, 1918. The Great War has ground on for 4 years. Millions are dead. The Western Front is a wasteland of mud and wire and corpses. German commander Erich Ludendorff believes his army can still win. Then he receives reports from the front at Amiens. Canadian forces have smashed through his defenses. They advanced 13 kilometers in a single day. Fog provided cover for their advance. Tanks rolled over German positions, spreading chaos and fear. Entire German units surrendered without firing a shot. Others ran. By evening, Ludendorff knows the war is lost. He calls August 8th the Black Day of the German army. The psychological impact is devastating. If the Canadians can break through this easily, nowhere is safe. Over the next 96 days, the period that would become known as Canada's 100 Days, 100,000 Canadian soldiers engage elements of 47 German divisions. That is 1/4 of all German forces on the entire Western Front. The Canadians fight at the Somme, at the Scarpe, at the Canal du Nord, at Cambrai, at Valenciennes, and finally at Mons. They are always at the tip of the spear, always leading the attack, always breaking through. When the Second World War begins, German soldiers who fought in the Great War tell stories to the younger men. They warn them about the Canadians. A captured German colonel will later explain his hatred to a Canadian prisoner. "I don't care for the English, Scotch, French, Australians, or Belgians," he says. "But damn you Canadians, you take no prisoners and you kill our wounded. This is not entirely fair. Canadian soldiers do take prisoners. They do treat wounded enemies. But the reputation for ruthlessness is not completely unearned either. Picture a night on the Western Front in 1917. It is 3 a.m. Most soldiers on both sides are asleep. The only sounds are the distant thump of artillery and the occasional crack of a sniper rifle. Then, from the Canadian trenches, dark figures emerge. They have blackened their faces with burnt cork. They wear thick rubber gloves. They carry clubs studded with nails. They carry push daggers and trench knives. They carry grenades and wire cutters. These are the trench raiders. They move silently across no man's land. They know where the gaps in the barbed wire are because they cut those gaps during earlier patrols. They know where the German sentries stand because they have watched for days. They know which dugouts hold German officers. The raiders reach the German trench. A sentry turns. Before he can shout a warning, a Canadian soldier is on him. The fight is quick and brutal. More raiders drop into the trench. They move fast. Grenades tumble downstairs into the dugouts below. Explosions, screaming, the crack of rifle fire. German soldiers scramble out of their bunks. Some grab weapons, some try to surrender, some just run. The Canadians move through the trench system like ghosts. They destroy equipment. They capture prisoners for intelligence. They kill anyone who resists. After 20 minutes, they vanish back into no man's land. In the morning, the Germans find their trench wrecked. Dead soldiers lie everywhere, and on some of the bodies, there are small stickers. The stickers show a unit patch in words in German. Das dicke Ende kommt noch. The worst is yet to come. Other Allied forces conduct trench raids too, but the Canadians become obsessed with them. They raid more often than anyone else. They develop better techniques. They create specialized weapons just for raiding. When other nations grow tired of the casualties and stop raiding, the Canadians keep going. An Australian officer will say that raids are not worth the cost, and his men do not want to do them anymore. The bloody-minded Canadians disagree. They raid German trenches until the very end of the war. This aggressive, innovative style of fighting carries over to World War II. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the 3rd Canadian Division lands at Juno Beach. British forces land at Gold and Sword Beaches. American forces land at Utah and Omaha. All 5 beaches see heavy fighting. But by the end of D-Day, the Canadians have advanced farther inland than any other Allied force. They push nearly to Carpiquet Airfield, their assigned objective. The British are described as competent and professional, but slow. They attack only when they have overwhelming superiority. The Americans are seen as enthusiastic and aggressive, but inexperienced. They make mistakes that cost lives. The Canadians are different. They combine aggression with adaptation. They learn from every fight. They share lessons across units. When something doesn't work, they discard it and try something new. This makes them unpredictable. This makes them dangerous. The mouse-holing technique developed at Ortona spreads. Other Allied forces adopt it. After the war, it becomes part of NATO military doctrine. Today, armies around the world teach urban warfare tactics that trace directly back to Captain Longhurst's innovation in December 1943. An even more dramatic example of Canadian fighting effectiveness comes from the 1st Special Service Force. This is a joint unit of 1,800 soldiers, roughly 1,200 Americans and 600 Canadians. They are nicknamed the Devil's Brigade. At Anzio in Italy, they hold 13 kilometers of front line with a force that is 40% under strength. They fight for 99 consecutive days without relief. The statistics are staggering. For every man the Devil's Brigade loses, they kill 25 enemy soldiers. For every one of their men captured, they take 235 prisoners. They conduct aggressive night patrols. They leave their trademark stickers on German corpses and fortifications. Die Schwarzen Teufel. The Germans call them the Black Devils. By 1945, Canada's contribution to the war effort is enormous. From a nation of just 11 million people, 1.1 million Canadians serve in uniform. The Royal Canadian Navy becomes the 3rd largest navy in the world, behind only the United States and Britain. The scale of this mobilization is remarkable. 1 in every 10 Canadians is in military service. The mouse-holing of Ortona, the trench raids of the Great War, the shock attacks that broke German lines again and again. These are not the actions of naturally violent men. These are the actions of soldiers who refuse to lose, soldiers who adapt, soldiers who fight not for conquest, but for freedom. And that makes all the difference. The tactics that Captain Longhurst pioneered in the rubble of Ortona did not die when the guns fell silent. They lived on. The mouse-holing technique became standard military doctrine. Today, armies around the world study what happened in those ancient Italian streets. Military academies teach the lessons learned in December 1943. Urban warfare manuals include diagrams showing how to breach walls and clear buildings room by room. The aggressive patrolling methods developed in the trenches of World War I evolved into modern special operations doctrine. The Canadian Special Operations Regiment traces its lineage directly back to the trench raiders who terrorized German positions with their nighttime attacks. Joint Task Force 2, Canada's elite counter-terrorism unit, follows in the same tradition of innovation and aggression. The influence extends beyond Canada's borders. The United States Army Special Forces, commonly known as the Green Berets, claim descent from the 1st Special Service Force. The Navy SEALs study the same principles. When American and Canadian commandos formed the Devil's Brigade in 1942, they created a blueprint for all special operations forces that came after. The emphasis on unconventional tactics, on operating behind enemy lines, on creating fear and confusion in the enemy. These are the hallmarks of modern special forces, and they all trace back to those early experiments in combined arms raiding. But the most powerful legacy of Canadian soldiers in World War II is not military. It is human. It is the bond formed between liberators and the liberated. It is the friendship between Canada and the Netherlands that continues to this day. In the spring of 1945, 175,000 Canadian soldiers fought to free the Netherlands from Nazi occupation. For 5 years, the Dutch people had suffered under German rule. Food was scarce, fuel was gone. During the hunger winter of 1944 and 45, over 20,000 Dutch civilians starved to death. Children ate tulip bulbs to survive. People burned furniture to stay warm. It was a desperate time. Then the Canadians came. Town by town, village by village, they drove the Germans out. Dutch civilians lined the streets, waving flags and throwing flowers. They cheered until their voices were hoarse. They wept with joy. After 5 years of darkness, light had returned. The liberation came at a terrible cost. More than 7,600 Canadian soldiers died freeing the Netherlands. They are buried far from their homes in 3 immaculate war cemeteries maintained by the Dutch people. The graves are perfectly kept. Fresh flowers appear regularly. Dutch schoolchildren visit to learn the names of the fallen. On December 24th each year, candles are lit in remembrance. The Dutch have never forgotten. They cannot forget. In 1945, Princess Juliana of the Netherlands sent 100,000 tulip bulbs to Ottawa as a token of gratitude. Canada had sheltered her and her family during the war. Her daughter, Princess Margaret, was born in Ottawa in 1943. The Canadian government temporarily declared the maternity ward to be extraterritorial so that the princess would have only Dutch citizenship. Every year since 1945, the Netherlands sends 20,000 tulip bulbs to Canada. 10,000 come from the royal family. 10,000 come from the Dutch Bulb Growers Association. Each spring, these tulips bloom in Ottawa, a living reminder of sacrifice and friendship. The Canadian Tulip Festival draws hundreds of thousands of visitors. The flowers are beautiful, but they represent something more beautiful. They represent freedom. When Dutch children study World War II in school, they learn about the Canadians who saved their grandparents. Some schools participate in a program called Faces to Graves, creating digital records with photos and stories for each Canadian soldier buried in Dutch soil. The connection between the two nations runs deep. It is not just government to government. It is person to person, family to family. In 2020, and to mark the 75th anniversary of liberation, the Netherlands sent 1.1 million special tulip bulbs to Canada. Orange-colored Liberation 75 tulips with petals shaped like crowns. 1 bulb for each Canadian who served in World War II. Schools across Canada planted them. Communities created memorial gardens. The flowers bloomed that spring, a sea of orange stretching across the nation. The individuals who earned this respect have their own stories of what came after. Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Currie, the Corps commander who led Canadians to victory after victory in World War I, became recognized as one of the finest military leaders the Western Front produced. His emphasis on careful planning, thorough training, and willingness to adapt made the Canadian Corps the most effective fighting force in the British Empire. Captain Bill Longhurst, whose innovation at Ortona saved countless lives, survived the war and returned home. His mouse-holing technique is still taught at military schools. His name appears in history books about urban warfare. What he created in a moment of desperate need became doctrine studied by generals. Private Ernest "Smoky" Smith earned the Victoria Cross, Canada's highest military honor for his actions in Italy. Facing German tanks and infantry near the Savio River, Smith single-handedly held his position with a Piat anti-tank weapon and his Thompson submachine gun. He destroyed 1 tank, drove off another, and held the Germans back until reinforcements arrived. He was the last living Canadian recipient of the Victoria Cross from World War II when he died in 2005. These men were not soldiers by trade. Currie was a real estate broker before the war. Longhurst was a volunteer who answered the call. Smith worked odd jobs before enlisting. They were ordinary people who did extraordinary things when their countries needed them. What made Canadian soldiers different was not superior weapons or overwhelming numbers. It was adaptability. When poison gas appeared at Ypres, they improvised gas masks from urine-soaked cloth and held the line. When trenches created stalemate, They developed aggressive raiding tactics to dominate no man's land. When urban fighting in Ortona threatened to stall their advance, they invented mouseholing. In a war defined by rigid doctrine and commanders who repeated the same failed tactics over and over, Canadians learned from their mistakes. They shared information. They tested new methods in small engagements before using them in major battles. When something didn't work, they tried something else. This willingness to adapt, to think differently, to refuse to accept that the impossible was truly impossible, made them feared by their enemies and valued by their allies. Military historian Tim Cook wrote that the Canadians transformed trench raiding to a deadly art, which wore away at the enemy's morale and strength as he was kept taut and nervous whenever opposite the wild colonials. That description captures something essential. The Canadians were unpredictable. They attacked when attack seemed impossible. They appeared where they should not be. They refused to follow the rules that governed conventional warfare. Today, aging Canadian veterans, some now over 100 years old, return to the Netherlands for anniversary celebrations. Dutch families host them. Streets are lined with people waving Canadian flags. The veterans ride in parades while schoolchildren cheer. One veteran said that every time he returns, it feels like coming home to a family you never knew you had, except they never forgot us. This is what remains when the battles are over and the weapons are silent. This is what matters. Not the tactical innovations or the military victories, important as those are. What matters is that young men crossed an ocean to fight tyranny. They liberated people they had never met. They gave their lives so that others could be free. And the people they saved have never stopped saying thank you. The Germans feared Canadian soldiers because those soldiers represented something the Germans could not understand. They represented free people fighting for a cause larger than themselves. They were not conscripts forced into uniform. They were volunteers who believed that freedom was worth fighting for, worth dying for. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson. The most dangerous enemy is not the one with the most tanks or the biggest army. It is the one who adapts, who innovates, who refuses to give up, the one who fights not for conquest, but for something worth the sacrifice. The Germans learned to fear that, and by the time they learned, it was too late.